The wind off the sea had a taste to it that morning. Salt and cold stone, and something greener underneath, like wet grass that had never quite dried. It came up over the cliffs of Merrimere in slow, heavy pushes, and it lifted the edges of Vivian Ashcombe's cloak as she walked the narrow path above the tide. She had walked this path since she was a small girl. She knew where the ground gave a little under a boot. She knew where the gorse hid a dip that could turn an ankle. She knew that the gulls stopped crying near the old wooden fence, because the wind past that point was too rough for them to hover. She walked with her head slightly lowered, not because she was afraid of the drop, but because the wind was strong enough to sting the eyes if a person looked at it straight. She was not supposed to be walking alone. Her aunt had told her twice that morning, in a voice that was tired rather than angry, that a young woman of 21 ought not to wander the cliffs like a fisher's child. Her aunt had said this while stirring sugar into weak tea. And the spoon had made a small clink against the china that had sounded, to Vivian, like a bell warning her to sit still. She had listened. She had nodded. Then she had put on her cloak and gone anyway, because the house had smelled of coal, smoke, and old wool, and she had needed the salt and the wind and the sound of the sea more than she needed to be a proper woman for one more hour. She was not a beauty. She knew this the way a person knows the weather. Her mouth was too wide. Her chin was too plain. Her hair, dark and thick, refused to lie the way fashion asked it to lie. Her eyes were her one good feature, a soft grey that people sometimes remarked on when they had run out of other things to say. She had learned, at balls and at dinners, to sit at the edge of the room and adjust her gloves and count the panes in a window. She had learned to be pleasant without being present. She had learned to disappear while still standing in plain sight. It had not been a hard thing to learn. It had happened to her all her life. The path bent toward the point where the cliff dropped sharpest, and here the gorse grew low and mean, and the wind slapped up the face of the rock with a sound like slow, hollow drums. She stopped a few yards from the edge and looked out. The sea was grey and rough and beautiful. Far below, the white lines of the surf moved, and broke, and moved again. A single ship, small as a child's toy, made its slow way toward the harbour to the east. The cold on her face felt clean. Her breath came out in small white clouds that the wind snatched away before she could see them fully. It was in that quiet, ordinary moment that she heard the sound. It was a small sound. It was not a cry. Exactly. It was closer to the noise a puppy might make if it had put its paw down on something sharp. It came from below the edge of the cliff, past the gorse, past the fence that leaned like a drunk man against the wind. Vivienne turned her head. She listened. It came again. This time she heard the shape of it, a child, and not a very old one, trying not to weep and failing. She moved before she thought. She went to the fence. She put her hand on the top rail, and it was wet under her palm and rough with old paint that had been eaten by salt. She looked over it, past the gorse, and she saw him. The boy was small. He could not have been more than 7. He had climbed or slid past the fence and down the sloping shelf of grass that lay just beyond it. The shelf looked, from a distance, like solid ground. It was not. It was a thin lip of turf clinging to a rock that fell away nearly straight into the sea. He had gone perhaps 12 feet past the fence. He was sitting now, very still, with his small hands pressed flat into the wet grass on either side of him. His face was turned up toward her. He had bright hair the color of a fox in winter, and it was stuck to his forehead with damp. His mouth was pressed into a line that was trying very hard to be brave. "Please," he said. It was almost a whisper. "I cannot get up." Vivienne's stomach dropped as if she had stepped off a stair in the dark. She did not move for a long second. She was aware of the wind, of the cold rail under her hand, of the taste of salt on her lips, of the boy's small pale face waiting for her to be an adult. She was aware, most of all, of the sound of the sea below, the deep hollow noise it made as it hit the rock, and she understood in that moment, as if someone had spoken it into her ear, that if the boy moved wrong, he would be gone. "Do not move," she said. Her voice came out low and calm, and she was surprised by it. Do you hear me? Do not move at all." The boy nodded, very small. His hair moved when he nodded. She looked around. The path was empty. The cliff was empty. There was no gardener, no shepherd, no fisherman, no one. There was only her, and there was only him, and there was only the wind. She thought, for one useless second, of running back to the house. It was half a mile. He would not sit still for half a mile. He was already shaking. She could see the small, quick tremble in his shoulders. She put her foot on the lower rail of the fence. She had never in her life climbed anything more difficult than a garden gate. Her skirts were long, and her boots were thin, and her hands would not stop feeling numb from the cold, but she put her foot on the lower rail, and then her other foot on the upper rail, and then she was over. She dropped down onto the grass on the wrong side of the fence with a small, undignified sound. Her cloak caught on a splinter. She pulled it free. A thread stayed behind. She did not care. "I am coming to you," she said. "I am coming slowly. Keep looking at me." He kept looking at her. His grey-green eyes did not blink. She went down on her hands and knees. This was the only way. If she stood, the wind would pick at her skirts and her balance would go and she would slide, and then there would be two people on the wrong side of the fence with nothing to hold. So she went down onto her hands and knees, and she felt the cold, wet grass push through the wool of her gloves, and she smelled the strange, sharp smell of crushed sea thrift, and she began to crawl. The grass was slick. Twice her hand slipped, and she had to catch herself with her elbow. Her heart was beating so hard that she could feel it in her throat. She did not look at the sea. She looked at the boy, only at the boy, his small fox-like hair, his serious mouth, his hands pressed flat. "What is your name?" she said. She said it because she had read once in a book that when a person was very frightened, hearing their own name spoken kindly was like a small blanket dropped over them. "Tobin," he whispered. "Tobin," she said. "That is a very fine name. Mine is Vivienne. I am going to reach you in a moment. When I do, I want you to give me one hand. Only one, not both. Do you understand?" "Yes," he said. She crawled another arm's length. The grass thinned. She could see, past the boy's shoulder, the raw rock beneath the turf, and she could see how the shelf simply stopped, and past the stopping was air, and past the air was the long grey drop and the surf far below. She swallowed. "Do you live nearby?" she asked, because her own voice was steadying her. "I am visiting," he said. "My uncle. He is at Ashfell." Ashfell. She knew Ashfell. It was the great grey house that sat 2 miles east along the coast, half hidden in old beech woods. It had been closed up for a long time. It had lately, she had heard from her aunt's maid, been reopened. She had heard the name of its new master spoken twice at church, in that particular hush that people used when they meant a name to feel large. "The Duke of Marlbrook," she said, more to herself than to him. "Yes," said Tobin, and his lip trembled. "He will be angry." "He will not be angry," said Vivienne, though she had no idea whether that was true. She reached out her right hand. Her glove was black with mud now, and the fingertips of the wool were dark with cold water. She stretched her arm as far as it would go without shifting her weight, and the boy stretched his small hand toward her, and their fingers were still a foot apart. "Closer," she said. "Slide. Just a little. Toward me. Keep your other hand pressed down. Slide only your seat." Slowly, he tried. He shifted his small body an inch toward her. Under him, the turf made a sound like a piece of cloth tearing very slowly. Vivienne's mouth went dry. She flattened herself further. She dug the toes of her boots into the grass behind her. She felt the small, hard root of gorse push against her hip, and she felt the wet come through her cloak at the shoulder. And she felt the wind pull at the loose hair by her ear, and she reached, and her fingertips brushed his fingertips, and then closed around his small, cold hand, and she pulled. She pulled him toward her in one long, slow motion, and he came, first sliding, then scrambling on his knees, and then he was against her side, small and shaking and warm inside all that cold. and she held him with the arm that was not pushed into the mud, and she said, "Good boy, oh good boy," in a voice she did not know she owned. She did not weep. She had never been the sort of woman who wept when things went well. They crawled back together. It was slower going up the slope than it had been coming down. She kept him ahead of her. She kept one hand at his back at all times. She kept talking. Of nonsense. Of a horse her father had once owned. Of the color of the sky. Of the fact that his hair was the same red as a jam she had once eaten as a girl. He listened. He did not answer much. But once when she said the word jam, he made a small hitching sound that was almost a laugh, and something inside her chest. That had been squeezed very tight for the last quarter of an hour, loosened by a small notch. They reached the fence. She lifted him first. He was lighter than she had guessed. He went over it neatly and stood on the good side of the world, small and streaked with mud, and then she came over after him, less neatly, and her skirt tore audibly on the top rail. And she felt the tear as one might feel the cutting of a rope from around the wrist. They stood together on the path. It was then, and only then, that she heard the hoofbeats. They came fast from the east, hard and quick against the packed earth, and around the bend of the path came a horse and a rider, and both were breathing steam. The rider pulled up so hard that the horse's back hooves scraped the dirt and threw small stones into the gorse. He was off the saddle before the animal had fully stopped. He did not tie it. He did not look at it. He came toward them in 3 long strides, and he went down on one knee in the mud in front of the boy, and he took the small fox-like head in both his gloved hands and looked into the boy's face. "Tobin," he said. Only that, only the name. But the name was said with a weight that made Vivienne take an unconscious step backward. "Uncle," said the boy, and his brave face broke at last, and he threw his small arms around the man's neck and began, quietly, to cry. The Duke of Marlborough did not move for a long moment. He held the child. His shoulders, which had been squared and hard, softened only slightly, but Vivienne saw it. His gloved hand pressed flat against the small back. His other hand cupped the wet red hair. He closed his eyes. She saw him swallow. Then he opened his eyes and looked at her. He was not a handsome man in the way the books made dukes handsome. His face was too long, his brow too heavy, his mouth too grave. He had dark hair that fell over his forehead where the wind had thrown it. He had eyes the color of wet slate. He was not smiling. He did not seem to know how to smile in that moment. He looked at her the way a man looks at a thing that has just given him back his life. "You," he said. His voice was low and rough at the edges. "You went over the fence." "I did," she said. Alone, there was no one else. He did not answer that for a moment. He stood, still holding the boy against him, the child's face pressed into the shoulder of his greatcoat, and he looked at her. And then he looked at the fence, and then he looked, very briefly, past the fence at the shelf of turf and the drop beyond it. His jaw moved once. He did not speak. "He was on the shelf," Vivienne said. Her voice was very calm now. She was surprised to find that her hands were shaking. She hid them in her cloak. "I heard him. I could not reach him without going over. He is a brave boy. He did what I told him to do." The Duke looked down at his nephew. Tobin lifted his wet face from the coat. "She told me not to move," said Tobin. She said it in a low voice like Papa used to. At the word Papa, something passed across the Duke's face. It was there for the length of a breath, and then it was gone. Vivienne saw it. She did not remark upon it. "Come," said the Duke, and he lifted the child up into his arms as if the child weighed nothing at all. "Come here." He turned to Vivienne. He stood there, holding his nephew, and the wind pulled at his coat, and he looked at her as if he did not know what to do next. He was, she realized, a man who was accustomed to knowing what to do next. He did not know now. "You are wet through," he said at last. "You are shaking." "I am well." "You are not well." She almost laughed. She caught it in time. "I am well enough." He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Ashfell is nearer than any other house. I will take you both. My groom will ride ahead." "That is not necessary," she said. "My aunt's house is only." "It is necessary," said the Duke. He did not raise his voice. He simply spoke as a man speaks who is not accustomed to being disagreed with, and who is not, in that moment, unkind about it. Vivienne, who had spent her life being pleasant, felt something in her that wanted to argue for the sake of arguing. She looked at the boy instead. Tobin was watching her over his uncle's shoulder. His small hand had crept up to grip the collar of the greatcoat. He needed her, in the way small creatures need a familiar face after a fright. She saw it. "Very well," she said. Ashfell rose out of the beechwood like a grey animal that had been asleep for a long time and was only now beginning to move. Its long windows were mostly still shuttered. Only the ones on the ground floor at the south side had been opened, and from those a warm yellow light came. Pale in the afternoon damp. The gravel of the drive crunched under the wheels of the small trap the Duke had arranged for her, and the smell of wood smoke came out to meet them as the trap slowed. Under the smoke there was another smell, old stone, cold plaster, and the sweetness of beech leaves rotting in the drives. She was brought inside. A housekeeper with grey hair pulled tight, and a plain black gown took her cloak with a small gasp at the state of it, and led her to a small drawing room with a fire that had clearly just been lit. The fire was still finding its feet. It hissed and popped where a green stick had gotten in among the good dry ones. The housekeeper brought a woolen shawl and a cup of tea that was too hot and too strong, and exactly what Vivienne needed. She sat close to the fire. She let the heat bite through the wet wool of her sleeves. She listened to the tick of a long clock somewhere in the hall. She could hear, from a room above, the small, quick footsteps of the boy Tobin, and the deeper, slower footsteps of the Duke. And a woman's voice, the nurse, she supposed, going on in a soft flurry of clucking. She could hear water being poured. She could hear a door close. Then, some minutes later, she heard the footsteps come down the stairs. He came into the drawing room without knocking. Because it was his house. He had taken off his greatcoat. His waistcoat was dark blue and plain. His hair had been pushed back off his forehead with an impatient hand. He was, she thought, a man who did not fuss about his appearance because he had been born knowing that no one would fail to look at him, whether he fussed or not. He crossed to the fire and stood before it, hands folded behind his back, and looked at her for a moment before he spoke. "He is not hurt," he said. "A scrape on the knee. Nothing worse. He has been given warm milk. He is asleep." "I am glad," she said. She meant it. He nodded once. He seemed to be searching for the correct words and finding that none of them were quite what he wanted to say. She had never seen a man like him at a loss. It fascinated her more than she wanted to admit. "Miss Ashcombe," he said. He knew her name. She wondered how. Perhaps the housekeeper. Perhaps her aunt was known even here. "I owe you a debt. You owe me nothing. I owe you my nephew's life. You owe him his own courage," she said. "He did what I told him. He did not thrash. He did not weep until he was safe. I have known grown men who could not have done as well." The Duke was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You are trying to give the gift back." "I am trying to say what is true. They are not the same thing, Miss Ashcombe." There was something in the way he said her name that made her look up. His face had not softened, but his eyes had. Not by very much. Just enough that she could see the man behind the Duke for one small instant, and the man behind the Duke was very tired. She looked down into her tea. She did not know what to do with what she had just seen. "Where is his mother?" she asked, because she needed to ask something, and because the child had said Papa in the past tense. The Duke did not answer for a beat too long. "She died," he said. 2 winters passed. Her husband, my brother, died 6 months after. There is only me. And him." He paused. "There is only him." She looked up again. He was not looking at her now. He was looking at the fire. "I am very sorry," she said. "For all of it." He gave a small nod. It was the nod of a man who had received condolences many times and had run out of ways to receive them, and who had, in her simple, honest words, been given something slightly different from what he was used to. She saw him hear the difference. He did not remark on it. A silence sat between them. It was not comfortable, but it was not painful either. It was the silence of 2 people who had just been through the same small, terrible thing, and were still, quietly, coming down from it. "You are staying to supper," he said at last. "I could not possibly. You are staying to supper. Your aunt has been sent word. Your carriage will come at 8. You will eat something warm and dry before you leave this house, Miss Ashcombe. I am afraid I must insist." She smiled, a little, into the fire. "You are very used to insisting." "I am," he said. Then, after a small pause, in a voice she had not heard from him yet, "I am trying to be less so." The supper was quiet. It was set in a small room that had once been used, she guessed, as a morning room, and had been pressed into service until the great dining room could be reopened. There were fresh candles on the table. They had been trimmed, and the wicks stood straight. The candles smelled faintly of beeswax and something sweeter, a herb, pressed into the wax, at the making. She noticed. She always noticed such things. Her aunt's candles at home smelled of nothing, because they were tallow. The Duke sat across from her, not at the head of the table, but near her. He ate simply: roast fowl, bread, a soup she could not name that tasted of leeks and cream and pepper. He asked her small questions, and she answered them. He asked what her aunt's household consisted of. He asked whether she had been long at Merrowmere. He asked how she took her tea. She noticed that he was collecting information about her, in the same careful way he might have collected information about a tenant's field before purchasing it, and yet the collecting did not feel like a transaction. It felt like the work of a man who was, for reasons she could not entirely name, unwilling to let this conversation be forgotten by morning. Once, near the end of the meal, she looked up and found that he was watching her, not eating. He had a piece of bread torn in half in his hand. He was not looking at his plate. He was looking at her. She held his gaze for a heartbeat. Then 2. Then 3. Neither of them looked away. He set the bread down. He drew in a breath that seemed to steady him. He said quietly, "You do not know what you did today, Miss Ashcombe." "I know very well what I did," she said. "I climbed a fence." "You climbed a fence," he repeated, and the corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the ghost of one, kept on a very short lead. The carriage came at 8. She did not want to leave the warmth of the small room, and the strange soft-lit table, and the Duke who had discovered how to almost smile. But she rose, and she thanked the housekeeper, and she took her mended cloak from the maid, and she was handed up into the carriage by the Duke himself, who stood in the drive without a hat, and did not seem to feel the cold. He held her gloved hand a second longer than was strictly correct. Then he stepped back and closed the door, and the carriage moved away, and she watched him through the window as long as she could, standing tall and grave in the yellow spill of the lantern by the door. She thought, on the ride home, of many things. She thought of the small pale face of the boy. She thought of the sound of the turf tearing. She thought of the taste of the salt on her lips, and she thought of the way the Duke's eyes had softened, only just, at the moment when she had said what was true instead of what was expected. She did not think that she had fallen in love. She would not have used such a word. She only knew that something in her, which had been carefully folded away for a long time, had opened a little without her permission, and she did not know how to fold it back. Her aunt met her in the hall, in a state of high alarm and low relief. Her aunt was a small woman with a large voice, and the voice went up and down in the manner of a bird trapped indoors while she scolded and fussed, and pressed the whole of Vivienne against her thin front. Vivienne allowed it. She told the story once. Her aunt listened, hand at her throat. When Vivienne was done, her aunt said in a hushed voice, "The Duke of Marlbrook." "Vivienne." "The Duke." "Yes, aunt. He handed you into the carriage himself." "Yes, aunt. He owes you a great deal." "He owes me nothing," said Vivienne, and she meant it. She excused herself, and she went up to her small room under the eaves, and she took off her ruined skirt, and she stood in her shift with the window open a crack, and she smelled the sea, and she listened to it. And she went to sleep with the salt still on her hair. He came the next afternoon. The knock at the door came at 3, and the maid came flying to the sitting-room in a state of nerves to say that His Grace the Duke of Marlbrook had come and was standing in the hall. Vivienne's aunt shrieked in a small strangled way and began to fuss with the cushions. Vivienne rose. She smoothed her skirt. She walked into the hall. He stood there with his hat in his hands. The hat was very fine and quite new. He looked slightly out of place in the small tidy hall, the way a large horse looks out of place indoors. He bowed to her. "Miss Ashcombe, Your Grace, I have brought my nephew. He asked to see you. I hope this is not an imposition." She looked past him. In the door of the trap, held by a maid, was Tobin. His hair had been brushed. His small coat was buttoned neatly. He was looking at her with the same grave, hopeful face he had shown her on the cliff. "It is not an imposition," she said. "Please, come in. Both of you." They sat in the sitting room. Her aunt mercifully took charge of the tea. Tobin sat on a stool near Vivienne and would not stir from it, his small warm side pressed against her knee. He ate a piece of shortbread with great seriousness. The Duke sat opposite and drank tea in a way that made her think he did not usually drink tea and was making an effort. They spoke of little things. Her aunt spoke of the weather. The Duke replied politely. Vivienne answered a question Tobin asked about a small brass bird on the mantel. It had been her mother's. She did not say so. Before he left, the Duke said, in a voice pitched only for her ears while her aunt saw the child to the door, "May I call again?" It was not a question. It was not quite a command either. "You may," she said. He came again 3 days later. He came again the day after that. Each time he brought the child. Each time the child would sit near her and would speak, quietly, of small things. A horse he had been shown. A book with a picture of a whale. A nightmare he had had about the sea. Each time the Duke would sit across the room and drink tea he did not care for, and watch her, and speak little, and listen much. She was aware all of this time that she was being watched by more than the Duke and the child. Merrowmere was a small place. The village had 2 churches and 1 shop, and 4 houses that mattered, and every person in every one of the 4 houses had heard, by the end of that first week, that the Duke of Marlborough was calling at the house of Miss Ashcombe's aunt. Some of them found this delightful. Some of them found it curious. Some of them found it insupportable. Chief among the last was Mrs. Aurelia Netherby. Mrs. Netherby was a widow of 42. She lived in the best of the 4 houses. She had a daughter named Priscilla, who was 19 and pretty in the way that a china figure is pretty, very smooth, very correct, and very cold to the touch. Mrs. Netherby had, since the Duke's arrival at Ashfell, given 3 dinners for him. He had attended none of them. This was not, in Mrs. Netherby's mind, the Duke's failing. This was somehow, in her mind, Vivienne Ashcombe's failing. The world made no sense to Mrs. Netherby unless a person like Priscilla was at the centre of it, and a person like Vivienne was at the edge of it. Doing whatever quiet thing a person like Vivienne was meant to do. The invitation to the ball came on a Thursday. The ball was to be held at the Netherby house on the last Friday of the month. It would be a small ball, by county standards, but a fine one. It was called, on the card, in Mrs. Netherby's neat sharp hand, a welcome for His Grace the Duke of Marlborough. Everyone was invited. This was the difficulty. Mrs. Netherby could not exclude Vivienne without exciting talk, and Mrs. Netherby lived in horror of exciting talk that she had not herself begun. So Vivienne was invited. And so, on the last Friday of the month, Vivienne stood in the middle of Mrs. Netherby's crowded drawing-room in a plain gown of grey silk that had been her mother's, with a shawl of cream lace mended twice at the corner, and adjusted her gloves. She adjusted her gloves because that was her small private thing. She had done it at every ball she had ever attended. She would smooth the wrist first, then the top of the hand, then each finger in turn, and by the time she was done with the second glove, some small piece of her nerve had come back to her. Tonight, in the smell of hot wax and cologne and the crushed sweetness of hothouse lilies, she went through the little ritual 3 times before she stopped counting. The Duke was there. He stood by the fire in a coat of dark green with quiet silver buttons. He was surrounded, from the moment he stepped inside, by 5 daughters of 5 country families, all of whom had been positioned by their mothers within arm's reach of him. He listened to each of them in turn. He smiled at none of them. He looked once, across the room, at Vivienne, standing near a curtain with her gloves smoothed. He did not cross to her. There were too many eyes. She understood. Then, Mrs. Netherby came for her. Mrs. Netherby came in a rustle of dove-coloured silk, and her voice was warm and loud, and she pressed Vivienne's arm as she spoke, and every person within 12 feet of them stopped speaking to hear what she said. This, Vivienne understood at once, was the purpose of the ball. "My dear Miss Ashcombe," said Mrs. Netherby, "how very brave of you to come. In your mother's gown. She had such a quiet taste, did she not? Priscilla, dear, come and greet Miss Ashcombe. Priscilla has been so eager. Miss Ashcombe, we were all so alarmed to hear of your adventure on the cliff. Truly, to have climbed a fence in your skirts. It must have been a shock to your dignity." There was a small ripple of quick, false laughter around them. "I was not thinking of my dignity at the time," said Vivienne, mildly. "No, of course not. One does what one can in a crisis. Only I must say, dear, I did hope you would not, take too much on yourself. It does not do to be too much. Not for a lady of your situation. His Grace, of course, would have found his nephew himself had he been there. He would not have needed a woman to go crawling on the ground in her ribbons." There, that was it. That was the line. Vivienne felt it land the way one feels a small, cold pebble strike the side of the neck. It was not the crawling. It was not the ribbons. It was the phrase, "a lady of your situation," spoken in that soft, dropping voice, in a room where every person had turned to listen. The room did not go quite silent, but it dimmed. Voices dropped. Feet stilled. Fans paused. It was the particular hush that comes when society has scented blood. Vivienne did not answer for a long moment. She looked at Mrs. Netherby. Mrs. Netherby was smiling. Priscilla, at her mother's elbow, was smiling too, though her smile did not quite reach her eyes. Vivienne drew in a breath. She let it out slowly. Then she did the thing she had done all her life. She smiled. Not brightly, not falsely. A small, calm smile. "I shall remember, ma'am," she said, "that a lady of my situation is one who crawled in her ribbons to fetch a child off a cliff. I do not think I mind that description." The room did not laugh, but somewhere near the window, a small older woman with iron-grey hair, Mrs. Trant, whose husband had been vicar in Merrowmere for 30 years, brought her fan up to her mouth and turned her face away. Vivienne saw the fan tremble. She understood that Mrs. Trant was smiling behind it. Something in her chest steadied. She curtsied, small and correct, to Mrs. Netherby. She did not wait to be dismissed. She turned. She walked, without hurry, to the far side of the room. She did not look for the Duke. She did not look for anyone. She adjusted her glove. She counted to 10 in her head. She was, she noticed, not shaking. The Duke had seen it all. She discovered this later. She discovered it, in fact, that same night, though she did not know at the time that she was discovering it. What she saw at the time was this. The Duke, after Mrs. Netherby had said what she had said, did not immediately move. He stood by the fire. He did not look at Mrs. Netherby. He looked, once, at Vivienne. Then he looked, for a long moment, at the floor. Then he stepped away from the 5 daughters of the 5 country families. He crossed the drawing room. He did not cross to Vivienne. He crossed to the small bench in the corner where the old vicar's wife, Mrs. Trant, was sitting alone. He bowed to her. He asked her, in a voice loud enough to be heard by half the room, whether she would do him the honour of the next dance. Mrs. Trant, aged 71, blinked at him. Then she blushed like a girl. Then she said, "Your Grace is very kind. I have not danced these 15 years. "Then it is high time you did," said the Duke. He took her out onto the floor. He danced with her, once around, slowly, and he did not let her stumble. Mrs. Netherby's face went the colour of curdled milk. Priscilla's smile hardened. And every person in the room understood, all at once, that whatever Mrs. Netherby had thought she was doing with her sharp small line, she had lost the room in that moment, and the Duke had chosen his side without saying a single word about it. Vivienne saw all of this. She stood by the far window with her gloves smooth. She did not permit herself to weep. She would not give Mrs. Netherby the pleasure. But her eyes stung. He came to her when the dance was done. He bowed. He asked her for the next. "Your Grace," she said, "you do not need to. I am not doing what I need to do, Miss Ashcombe." He said, quietly, "I am doing what I wish to do." She gave him her hand. They danced. He was not a graceful dancer. He was too tall for the room. His feet were sure enough, but his shoulders held themselves with the wariness of a man who had learned to fill a doorway without quite meaning to. She, who was not tall, felt herself lifted by his lead. She felt, for the first time in her life at a ball, that she was in the room, rather than watching it. They spoke very little. Once, near the turn of the figure, he said, so low that only she could hear, "I am sorry that woman spoke to you as she did. You did not put the words in her mouth." "No, but I brought the eyes into the room." She looked up at him. He was looking straight ahead over her shoulder, at nothing in particular. His jaw was set. She understood, in that instant, that he had been thinking about this since Mrs. Netherby had spoken, that he had spent the whole of his dance with Mrs. Trant thinking about it, that he had considered a dozen responses and chosen the one that shamed no one publicly, and yet made his position absolutely clear. "You are very careful," she said. "I am trying to be less so," he said, without looking at her. She smiled. He felt her smile, though he did not turn. She saw the small motion at the corner of his mouth. Later, when the ball was thinning and the older guests were calling for their carriages, he found her by the door, cloak already over her arm. He did not touch her. He did not do anything improper. He only said, in a voice pitched only for her, "Tomorrow, I mean to walk on the cliff path, about 11. If you should happen to walk there also, I should not consider it an accident." She said, "I often walk there at 11. "I am glad to hear it," he said. She walked on the cliff path at 11. He was already there. He was standing at the fence, looking down at the shelf of turf where the boy had been. He turned when he heard her step. He did not smile. He said, "I have not been able to make myself stop looking at this piece of ground. It is only a piece of ground," she said. "The boy is home. The boy is well." The boy is well because a woman climbed over a fence in her skirts for a child she had never seen. She did not have an answer to that. She stood beside him at the fence. The wind was gentler today. The sea was more grey than white. A single gull hung in the air a little way out, unmoving, as if pinned there. She could smell the wet gorse. She could smell his coat, which was clean wool and cold air, and something underneath that she thought might have been the resinous smell of a good pipe, not recently smoked. "He asks after you," said the Duke. "Every day. Every hour, some days. He tells the nurse she is not you. I hope he is not unkind to her. He is not unkind. He is only faithful." They stood a moment. She adjusted her glove. "May I say something, Miss Ashcombe?" "You may. I am not a man who is easy in society. I do not do the small things well. I do not dance well. I do not flatter well. I do not know how to speak to a woman in a drawing-room without feeling that I am being asked to perform. I am not what you would find in the books. I know that." She looked at him. He was staring straight ahead at the sea. His mouth was tight. He was, she realized with something close to tenderness, embarrassed. "You are speaking to me now," she said. "You are doing it well enough. I am speaking to you now because I am not in a drawing-room. Then perhaps we shall have to stay out of drawing-rooms." He did smile at that, just a very small smile. It was gone almost as soon as it appeared, but she saw it. It changed the whole of his grave face. It made him look, briefly, like a man who had once been a boy. The autumn came on in slow layers of colder mornings and later dinners, and lengthening dark. She saw him 3 times a week, sometimes 4. Sometimes he came to the aunt's house. Sometimes she walked to Ashfell. Sometimes they met on the cliff path with a small basket of bread and cheese and cold apples, and they sat on a flat stone above the sea, and did not speak much, and did not need to. Tobin was often with them. Tobin was in fact the reason for many of the walks. Tobin had, in the weeks after the accident, refused to walk near the cliffs at all. His uncle told her this quietly one evening. and only in her presence, with her hand held in his hand, did he now permit himself to come near the edge of the fence. Vivienne would stand with him at the fence. She would let him look for as long as he wished. She would name the seabirds for him. She would tell him, when he was ready, that fear was only a message from a small, careful part of the mind, and one need not answer every letter it wrote. He would nod. He would grip her hand more tightly. He would let it go, in his own time. He walked further from the fence each week. She never made him. She did not know at first about the small, unexpected thing the Duke did. She learned of it in November, from the housekeeper of the aunt's small house. The housekeeper had a sister who was in service in the village. The sister was in service to the family of a man named Riddell, who kept a small horse and cart and did the fetching and carrying between Merrowmere and the harbour town to the east. Riddell had, that summer, been badly hurt. His cart had turned over on the coast road in a bad storm. His horse had been killed. His leg had been broken in 2 places. Riddell had a wife and 4 small children and no other income. The parish had done what it could. But the Riddell family had, in the weeks after the accident, been quietly saved from ruin. Quietly and completely. A new cart had appeared in the yard. A new horse, a good one, a chestnut mare with quiet ways, had been delivered. The rent on the Riddell cottage had been paid a full year in advance. The doctor had been sent for from town, and the doctor's bill had been settled the same night. No one knew, at first, who had done it. The housekeeper's sister eventually pried it out of one of the grooms at Ashfell. The groom, sworn to silence, had said only that His Grace had ridden out 3 nights running that summer, alone, and had come back late, and would not have any of the servants attend him on those rides. But the groom had, on one of those nights, gone into the stable to check on a mare in foal, and had seen the Duke lead his tired horse in himself. And the Duke's boots had been dirty with the particular clay of the Riddell yard. Vivienne heard the story from her aunt's housekeeper, who told it as gossip, in a hushed voice, over a small cake. Vivienne set her tea down. She sat very still for a long moment. She thought, of course, of the day on the cliff. She thought of the boy in her arms. She thought of the Duke going down onto one knee in the mud to hold his nephew. She thought of the way he had said, only that, only the name. She understood then that the Duke did not do these things because he wished to be known for them. He did them because he had been a boy who had lost, at least once, someone who mattered to him. He knew what it was to be the person left behind. He would not, if he could help it, allow that to be done to another family. She did not tell him she knew. Not for a long time. It was his kindness. It belonged to him. She only held it in her, the way she held the small brass bird from her mother's mantle, carefully, without display. The trouble came in December. It was Mrs. Netherby, of course. Mrs. Netherby had not forgiven the ball. Mrs. Netherby had spent the whole of the autumn thinking about it. She had, in the manner of certain kinds of women, refined and re-refined a single grievance until it had become a small, sharp weapon. She used it at the Christmas assembly. The assembly was the largest gathering of the season. It was held in the assembly rooms at the market town, and every family within 20 miles came. The Duke came. Vivienne came, on the arm of her aunt. Tobin was at Ashfell with the nurse. The rooms were hot with candles and packed with wool coats freshly damp from the drive. There was the smell of roasted chestnuts from a brazier by the door. There was the sound of a small band of country musicians murdering, gently and cheerfully, a set of dances that had been popular 20 years before. Mrs. Netherby was there with Priscilla. Priscilla had a new gown of ice blue silk. Mrs. Netherby had planned, one presumed, a great many things about this evening. She said her line early. She said it, this time, not to Vivienne, but to a small group of women near the refreshment table. She said it loudly enough for Vivienne, who was standing behind the table selecting a glass of lemonade she did not want, to hear every word. "I do think," said Mrs. Netherby, in her light, bright voice, "that His Grace has been most charitable to that Ashcombe girl. Truly, it is his Christian duty, I suppose." Her family was of course quite reduced. Her mother made an unfortunate marriage. It is very good of him to give her a season of attention, but one cannot expect it to last. A duke marries a duchess, not a girl who climbs fences. The women around her tittered, uncertain, wanting to please her. Vivienne set her glass down on the table very quietly. She did not turn. She did not run. She stood, very still. She could feel her face going hot. She could feel her hands wanting to shake. She was, for the first time in a long time, aware that she was quite alone in the middle of a very full room. She thought, quite suddenly, of the boy on the shelf. She thought of the way he had held her hand. She thought of what she had told him about fear. It was only a message. One need not answer every letter it wrote. She lifted her chin. She turned. She began to walk toward the door. She did not run. She did not look back. She had done this once before, at another sort of gathering, when she was 17, and she had learned then that the walking mattered more than the leaving. One walked slowly. One held the head level. One did not permit oneself to hurry. She walked slowly now. She did not know that the Duke had heard the line. She did not know that he had crossed the room while she was walking. She did not know, until she reached the door, that he was there before her, standing at the threshold with her cloak over his arm. He had taken it from the maid himself. He held it out to her. His face was without any expression at all. This, she had come to understand, was how his face looked when he was very angry. "May I walk you out, Miss Ashcombe? You need not. I am not asking whether I need to. I am asking whether I may." She let him put her cloak over her shoulders. His fingers brushed her collarbone through the wool. His hand was warm. Her skin was cold. They walked out into the hall together. The hall was quieter. A few servants moved about with trays. The air was cool. She drew in a breath of it. Her hands at last began to steady. "I am going home," she said. "I know. I do not wish to make a scene. I know." They stood in the hall. He was looking down at her. He said, in a low voice, "Miss Ashcombe, may I ask you to wait only for a moment? There is something I mean to do, and I should like you to be within hearing when I do it." She looked up at him. There was something in his face that made her heart go quite still. "What are you going to do?" "I am going to say a thing," he said, "in the assembly room. In front of them all. It has been half a year now, Miss Ashcombe. It is time." He did not wait for her to argue. He turned. He walked back through the door into the assembly rooms. She stood in the hall, cloak on her shoulders, and after a moment she followed him. She stopped in the doorway. She did not go further. He walked to the center of the room. He was not a man who ordinarily drew notice on purpose. When he chose to, however, he could pull a room's attention to him the way a hand pulls a curtain. He stopped near the musicians. He lifted one gloved hand. The music stopped. The dancers stopped. The talk faded, and then died. The room went silent. She felt it. She felt the whole great crowded hot room go still. Every fan stopped. Every glass stopped. Every conversation dropped away between one syllable and the next. People turned. People stared. Even the servants at the door froze mid-step. The only sound in the room was the small hiss of a candle guttering somewhere on the far wall. The Duke of Marlborough stood in the middle of that silence. He looked around the room slowly, without hurry. His eyes passed over Mrs. Netherby. They did not stop there. They passed over Priscilla. They did not stop there either. They found Vivienne in the doorway. They held her. "Ladies and gentlemen," said the Duke. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Every ear in the room was already bent toward him. "I have not spoken publicly on a certain matter, because I did not think it was any person's business but my own. I find, however, that when I do not speak, other people speak in my place, and they do so poorly." He paused, not for effect, simply to let the words settle. "6 months ago," he said, "my nephew, a small boy of 7, whom I love as though he were my own son, wandered too near the edge of the cliffs at Merrowmere. He would have died. He was over the fence. He was on ground that would not hold him. There was no man to help him. There was no gardener. There was no groom. There was no uncle." His jaw moved once. There was a young woman walking alone on the path. She heard him. She went over the fence to him in her skirts. She crawled to him across turf that could have given way at any moment. She brought him back. She saved his life. She did not ask for thanks. She did not ask for reward. She said it was nothing. She said he was a brave boy. She said I owed her nothing. He paused again. Now he looked at Mrs. Netherby. He did not glare. He looked at her the way one looks at a small stain on a good rug. I have heard it said, tonight and other nights, that I have been merely charitable to that young lady, that she is beneath my consideration, that her family is reduced, that a duke marries a duchess, not a girl who climbs fences. Mrs. Netherby's face was white. Her mouth was a small closed line. I say to you all now, said the Duke, and I say it plainly, so that it may not be misunderstood, I am not a man who marries a woman for her family. I am a man who marries a woman for what she does when nobody is watching, and for what she does when everybody is. Miss Vivian Ashcombe went over that fence for a child she had never seen. Miss Vivian Ashcombe walked out of Mrs. Netherby's drawing room this summer with more dignity than that drawing room has ever contained. Miss Vivian Ashcombe walked out of these assembly rooms tonight, quietly, without a word of complaint, after being publicly diminished by a woman who could not stand to be near her light. Somewhere near the back of the room, a glass touched a table too hard and broke. No one looked. No one moved. I have not asked her yet, said the Duke. It was not the way I intended to do it. I intended to ask her privately and properly, in her own home, in her own good time. But I will not have another word said of her in this county, in any tone but respect. And I will not have it wondered whether my interest is charitable or unclear. So I say it now. Before you, all of you, I intend to ask Miss Ashcombe to be my wife. Whether she accepts me is her own choice, freely made. But whether she accepts me or refuses me, I ask you all to remember what I have said. She is not the girl who climbs fences. She is the woman who saved my nephew's life. She is a woman worth 10 of any daughter you were hoping to place beside me tonight. There was silence, not the earlier silence, of attention. A new silence, the silence of a room that had been shown, all at once, exactly what kind of man had been standing in it, and had found that it was not the kind of man it had assumed. Vivienne did not know that her hand had come up to her mouth. She did not know that her eyes had filled. She was aware, chiefly, of two things, the smell of the candle wax and the cold ache of her fingers inside her gloves. She was aware, more distantly, of Mrs. Trant, the old vicar's widow, in a chair near the wall, quietly clapping her hands once, twice, 3 times. It was the smallest applause. It was, in that silence, enormous. A few others took it up. Then a few more. Then the room was, quietly and awkwardly and unmistakably, applauding. Mrs. Netherby did not applaud. Mrs. Netherby, in fact, sat down very suddenly in a chair that had not been meant for her. Priscilla stood beside her mother, ice blue silk perfectly arranged, and looked at the floor. The Duke did not linger for the applause. He bowed, briefly, to the room. He turned. He walked to the doorway where Vivienne stood. He did not take her hand. He did not touch her at all. He said, very quietly, "Now I will walk you out, Miss Ashcombe, if you will still have my arm." She could not, in that moment, speak. She lifted her hand. She rested it on his sleeve. They walked out together. Behind them, the assembly rooms slowly began to breathe again. Outside, the night was very cold. There had been a fine, dry snow that had come down while they were inside, only enough to whiten the tops of the carriages and the stone steps of the assembly rooms. The snow was still coming, in small, slow bits, and each bit made a tiny, pale sound as it landed on her cloak, and she could smell the strange, clean, cold smell of snow that has just fallen on damp stone. The lamps by the door burned yellow. The rest of the world was blue-black. He led her to his carriage. He did not open the door. He turned her, gently, so that she was facing him. He did not touch her face. He kept his hands at his sides. He looked at her. She looked at him. "That was not the way I meant to do it," he said. "No," she said. I am sorry that I did not ask you first. You did ask, she said. You asked me if you might say a thing. I let you. That is a kind of asking. He drew in a breath. He let it out. It made a small cloud between them that the wind took at once. Miss Ashcombe, he said. Vivienne, will you have me? She was quiet for a long moment. She was aware of the snow on her cloak. She was aware of the lamp behind his shoulder. She was aware of the small, quick thud of her own pulse in her throat. She was aware, most of all, of the way he was looking at her, not the way a man looks at a woman he has decided to want, but the way a man looks at a woman he has spent 6 months slowly and carefully deciding that he cannot do without. Why, she said quietly, tell me why. Truly, not the reasons you gave the room. He nodded. He had expected the question. Because on the day I met you, he said, you did not know I was a duke, and it made no difference. Because you told my nephew that fear was a letter one need not answer, and I have thought about that sentence every night since. Because Mrs. Trant, when I danced with her, said to me under her breath that you had once, when you were 16, sold your mother's shawl to pay a doctor's bill for your aunt's kitchen girl, and no one but Mrs. Trant knew of it. Because you did not tell me you had done it. Because you have not, in 6 months, asked me for a single thing. Because when I do not know what to do with Tobin, I think of what you would do, and I do it, and it is right. Because I did not know, before you, what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. Because I know now. He paused. He did not quite smile. But something in his mouth softened. And because, he said, you climbed a fence. She lifted her hand. She rested it against the front of his coat. She could feel his heart under her palm through the wool. It was going quicker than his face suggested. Yes, she said. I will have you. He closed his eyes for a moment. Only a moment. When he opened them, they were very bright. He did not kiss her. Not there, in front of the carriage, in front of the lamp. He took her gloved hand instead. He lifted it. He pressed his mouth to the knuckles of her glove gently once, and held it there for the space of a slow breath. She felt the warmth of his mouth through the wool. She felt the cold of the snow on the back of her neck. She felt, for the first time in her life, that she was not standing at the edge of a room. She was in the middle of one, and the room was hers. He drove her home in his carriage. He did not speak much on the ride. He did not need to. He sat across from her, and he looked at her when she was not looking at him, and she looked at him when he was not looking at her, and once. When their eyes met at the same moment, they both very slightly smiled. Her aunt was standing in the hall in her nightcap when Vivienne came in. Her aunt had heard, already, from 3 separate messengers, what had been said at the assembly rooms. Her aunt did not fuss, this time. Her aunt only put her thin hands on Vivienne's cold cheeks and looked at her for a long time and said, Your mother would have been proud tonight, my dear. She would have been proud of every step. Vivienne wept then, only a little, only into her aunt's shoulder, only for a moment. It was the first weeping she had done in a long time. They were married in the spring. It was a small wedding, at the little church in Merrimere, and Mrs. Trant, the vicar's widow, sat in the front pew and cried openly the whole way through. Tobin, aged 8 now, walked ahead of the bride with a solemn face and a fistful of primroses that he had insisted, over the housekeeper's protests, on picking himself that morning from the hedge at Ashfell. He gave them to Vivienne at the door of the church. He did not smile as he did it. He was too serious a boy for that. But he pressed his small warm hand into hers and kept it there all the way up the aisle, and would not let go until the Duke, standing at the altar, said in a voice like water breaking gently over stones, Thank you, Tobin. I have her now. Tobin nodded. He stepped back. He watched the whole of it with the same grave, hopeful eyes he had turned up to her from the shelf of turf that first day, and Vivienne felt, standing there in her mother's mended lace and her aunt's borrowed pearls, that she was being married not to one person, but to 2, and that this was, in fact, the entire point. Mrs. Netherby had left the county by then. She had gone, it was said, to visit a distant cousin in Bath, and had shown no inclination to return. Priscilla had married, quite suddenly and quietly, a curate in another parish. The county had, as counties do, adjusted itself, and had forgotten, or pretended to forget, the assembly rooms. The Duke did not forget. Vivienne knew. She saw it sometimes in the way he moved through a public room. He would not permit unkindness in his hearing. He did not lecture. He did not thunder. He simply stood and looked, and the unkindness dried up. A year on from the wedding, on a bright grey afternoon in late summer, Vivienne stood at the long window of the drawing-room at Ashfell and watched her husband walk with his nephew across the lawn. Tobin was 9 now, and taller by a hand than he had been. He walked with his shoulders back. He walked without holding anyone's hand. He walked most of the time without needing to. The Duke was speaking to him, seriously, of some small matter. Tobin was nodding. Somewhere behind them, the head gardener's small dog, a scruffy terrier the Duke had once, quietly, saved from a poacher's trap, went bounding along at their heels with a stick. The window was open a little. She could smell the cut grass. She could smell the beech leaves on the drive. She could smell, very faintly, the sea. She had a book open in her hand. On the same page it had been open for the last quarter of an hour. She had not read a word. She had been watching them. The Duke turned, as if he had felt her looking. He raised one hand to her, small only for her. She raised hers back, in the same small way. She thought, standing there in the yellow warm light of the drawing-room, of a fence above a cliff, and a small pale hand reaching up, and a boy who had not been able to get himself back, and a man who had knelt in the mud and held that boy's face in both his gloved hands, as if the child were the most precious thing in the world. She thought of what the Duke had said in the assembly rooms. Not the words for the crowd, the words for her, in the snow by the carriage, because you climbed a fence. She smiled to herself. She turned from the window. She set the book down on the small table by her chair, in a particular place he would notice when he came in, and she went out into the hall to meet him and the boy at the door, because the tea was ready, and the fire was lit, and the house. The whole grey, long sleeping house was, at last, awake. Some lives are saved on a cliff in one bright, terrible moment, and some lives are saved slowly, over many quiet months, by the small, honest work of 2 people learning to walk toward each other without hurry, and by that summer's end, in the warm rooms of Ashfell, Vivienne understood, with a quiet that felt like coming home, that she had been given the great fortune of both.